I'm Dori Segev. I'm one of the transplant surgeons and also statistician and epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins. Welcome to a webinar. The goal of this webinar is to dive deeper into the SRTR program-specific reports so that you can understand how they are constructed, why are they constructed in the way they are, and how you can use these to better understand regulatory action at your center's level. The first thing I'm going to do is go through the SRTR's website to show you where some of the technical resources are. So if we look here at the website, this is where you can pull up all of the SRTR reports. I'm going to focus on this bar here, which is the program-specific reports. And first we're going to go to technical methods. When you click on technical methods, these are some of the resources that are available to better understand how the program-specific reports are put together. The first thing here is you can click on this to see a slide set that the SRTR has put together describing a lot of the details. What I'm going to do is go through some of those slides, the ones that I think are the most important for clinicians to understand of this process. Before I do that, I'll point out a couple other resources. There are some OPO resources here, and then there's reference to the 2007 report and the 2005 report. These are published papers, so here's the 2005 report. This is the Center-Specific Reporting Tools, where they go through post-transplant outcomes. This is a worthwhile paper to read through if you're interested in this. And then there's another one here from the 2007 report, and I'm showing you that paper now. This is SRTR Program-Specific Reports on Outcomes, a guide for the new reader. Again, this goes through a lot of the technical methods of the SRTR reports, and this is worth reading as well. I'm going to start with the slide set here, and I've pulled a couple of slides that I think are worth going through in detail. This is the information flow of the SRTR data. And the reason I show this is that a lot of people ask, what is the difference between SRTR data, OPTN data, UNOS data, etc.? And here's what happens. So UNOS collects the data. So as you know, your center reports the data to UNOS, and UNOS is acting as the OPTN contractor. And then what happens is every month the OPTN shares the data with the SRTR. Now the SRTR does a few things. It cleans the data so that we can do analysis on the data, but it also links the data. You see here, it links the data to a number of really critical secondary resources. One of them is the Social Security Death Master File. So what happens is, as you know, we're looking at 1 year, 3-year survivals, etc. Sometimes we lose patients to follow-up at a given center, but the government never loses anybody to follow-up, and it keeps track of people through the Social Security Death Master File. So we can take somebody's information, link it with Social Security, and know if they're alive or dead. So for this outcome of patient survival, we actually have a hard measure, and that's through linkage with the Social Security Death Master File. In addition, you see here that we have CMS ESRD data. So when somebody loses a kidney, when they lose renal function, they either go back on dialysis or they get preemptively transplanted. Either of those two we can now find out. If they go back on dialysis and they never make it on the waiting list, then they never make it into the OPTN data, but they do make it into the CMS data. And so for kidney, we have a very good way of assessing graft loss because we know whether they've either gone back on dialysis, on the waiting list, or been transplanted. For the other organs, if you lose those functions, then you end up back on the waiting list anyway. The only one that we don't have great ascertainment for is pancreas because there's no registry of people who have no pancreas function. And so that we have to rely on center level reporting for. But for kidney, we have a great linkage to CMS. And for liver, obviously, we just know because they end up on the list or because they die from their disease. Anyway, with all of these linkages, this goes into an analysis file. There are standard analytical files that the public can request, and anybody can get these from the SRTR. And then the SRTR puts together the program-specific reports from these data. So the short answer to the difference between SRTR data and UNOS OPTN data is mostly that linkage with CMS and with Social Security death master file. When you get program-specific reports for your center, there are a whole bunch of tables that show up. So let me pull up a program-specific report here just so you can look at it. This is what the PDF looks like. You can see all of the information here. We can scroll through, and the first few pages are just information pages about what you're finding here. And then you see the summary of all of the information. You can get a graphic summary where you can look at your transplant rates, your waitlist mortality rates, adult graft and patient survival, pediatric graft and patient survival, etc. You can see them in graphic forms. You can see them in table forms, etc. I won't belabor how to read this particular report because it's pretty self-explanatory, but I will say that the thing that goes into the flagging for the program-specific reports are the one-year graft and patient survival. And so those are important to be familiar with, and that's why we're diving deep into the SRTR data today. So that's an example of one of these program-specific reports, and these are the tables that you find there, and then these last tables are the ones that are going to be the most interesting. Every 6 months in January and July, these are prepared, and then you get 1 month, 1 year, 3-year outcomes for 2.5 years worth of cohorts of recipients. Now, we get questions a lot about why there are these lags of time between the 1-year survival reports. And the point is that the 1-year outcomes are not available for 18 months because, first of all, you need 12 months for the 1-year outcome to know if it happened. And then you need submission of the forms, and then you need linkage, and then you need calculation of the statistics, etc. So together that takes 18 months. And then the other thing is you need a lot of patience because if you don't have enough of a sample size, the estimates of the statistical models are not stable. And so the PSRs use 2.5 year large cohorts to do this. And so that's why when you're looking at your current report, your very most recent report will have transplants that you did 3.5 or 4 years ago, and that's why you need that. So an important thing that I wanted to drill down today is about risk adjustment. And so the real question is, what rate would be expected for patients at your particular center if their outcomes were comparable to national outcomes for similar patients? And similar is defined by the characteristics that affect patient or graft survival that, and I'm going to add here, that are collected by the OPTN. So it's known right now that cardiovascular disease is not well collected by the OPTN, and so that can't go into these similarities because we just don't know who has cardiovascular disease. But we do know a lot about demographics, etiology of disease, severeness of illness, and all of that stuff goes in. We'll talk to you in more detail about that. And then if there are differences between that which was observed at the center and that which was expected by the center, because we're adjusting for these things, those differences are not due to anything that we are adjusting for. They're either due to the other things that we don't measure, or they're due to ways that that center is actually not performing as well as it should be. So how are the model variables chosen? So it's important to note that the SRTR does not work alone on developing these models. There's oversight by HRSA, there's oversight by the OPTN and the various committees, and there's also oversight by the STAC, the SRTR's Technical Advisory Committee. And remember that there's limitations by what variables are actually collected by the UNOS OPTN. The ones that are included in these models are variables that are statistically significant or nearly statistically significant, ones that are clinically important and thereby increase the face validity of the model. Ones that adjust for practice patterns are rejected because we don't want to write out the practice patterns. We want to actually see if those practice patterns affect the outcomes. Variables that are unstable get rejected, and then all of those models get reviewed by all the committees that I talked about, and then we end up with that final model. We get input from clinicians and statisticians, input from OPTN committees, as I talked about. And then as new data elements become available, which occasionally they do, they're considered for inclusion in the models using the criteria we just went through. There's a good example in this slide set on how we adjust for age. So here's the example. If the average survival nationally is 85%, and half of the patients are younger with 95% survival, and half the patients are older with 75% survival. So that's sort of what's the example of what's going on nationally. And then let's say we'll take your center, Center A, and Center A only treats older patients, but has 80% survival. So if we just compared Center A's survival with national survival, it's worse because Center A has 80% survival while national survival is 85%. And no one would go for that because obviously that's not accounting for Center A's, for their special practice that they have, right? But they have only older patients, and nationally older patients have a 75% survival. Center A is getting them transplanted with an 80% survival. So they're actually doing better than the expected survival, not worse than the national survival. And that's the kind of stuff that needs to happen so we can adjust for the risks that are being taken on. There are several things that the whole risk adjustment process handles, and I'm going to go through these slides now. So if we say Center X has 85 deaths and the national average is 13 deaths, well, Center X has a lot more deaths than the national average with no adjustment whatsoever. Should Center X be flagged? Well, Center X is actually a huge center compared to the average number of transplants performed nationally. So let's say in this example, Center X performs 586 transplants. Nationally, only 138 transplants are performed. Well, obviously, the 85, the proportion of that to 586 is different from the proportion of 13 to 138. So they're going to have more deaths because they do more transplants. But are they going to have that many more deaths? And so what we can do is we can look at the percent deaths. I'm simplifying this quite a lot because we actually use Cox proportional hazards models to calculate all these things. But suffice it to say, it works almost exactly like this, where you say, well, Center X we know has a higher volume, so 14.5% of their patients died versus national 9.5%. So they're still higher than the national average. Should they be flagged? Well, we still haven't accounted for the risk that they're taking on. And so, for example, here's a plot that shows the age of the recipients at Center X versus the age nationally. And you see nationally, they've got these younger patients, and at Center X, they've got these older patients. So they transplant more older patients, they will obviously have a higher death rate. So we need to account for that. And if we account for that by calculating expected deaths rather than just the number of observed deaths, that can take into account all of that. And at the end of the day, what we end up with is a ratio of the number of deaths observed to the number of deaths expected. And that ratio for Center X is 1.1. That ratio nationally is 1. It's a little bit higher. Is it higher enough? Well, if you look at the random variation, it crosses this 1. So it overlaps the national average. So no, it's not higher enough than the national average to flag Center X. So even though Center X had a lot of deaths, they were accounted for by the fact that it was a large volume center and it was a center taking on risk with older patients. And this center doesn't get flagged. And so that's an example of what risk adjustment means. Now, the other thing is that when you do these risk adjustments, you need at the end of the day to have some criteria for who actually does get flagged. Just like I showed you there, there's some variation that you need to account for. And so there are 3 criteria that have been determined, not just by the SRTR, but by everyone overseeing this, that have to be fulfilled for somebody to get flagged. One is it has to be what they call important. And by important, it means that the observed deaths minus the expected deaths has to exceed 3. So there have to be more than 3 excessive deaths. It also has to be what they call actionable, and that means clinically significant. And what they mean by that is that the ratio has to be greater than 1.5. I think this is a typo in the SRTR slide. So basically, you have to have 50% more deaths than we would have expected, and it has to be significant, and this is statistically significant. The p-value has to be less than 0.05. And if all of those things happen, then there's a flag for review. Now, it's important to know whether this is affecting you as a small center or as a large center. So in small centers, they can easily experience 50% more deaths than expected because the number of deaths is actually quite low. But it's hard to reach statistical significance, and it's actually hard to get 3 more deaths than were expected because the volumes are so low. So that's sort of the barrier for flagging of small centers. Now, large centers, it's sort of the opposite. It's very easy to reach statistical significance because the numbers are high, and it's very easy to reach more than 3 extra deaths because the numbers are high. But you have to also reach 50% more deaths than expected. And the example here is if you expected 40 and you had 50, that's more than 3 more, but that's only 25% more than in excess events, and this would not get you flagged. So it affects large centers very differently from small centers. It's important to know, I think this slide is one of the most important slides here because it shows the range of 1-year graft survival at the centers. And so if you're looking at like liver numbers, the 1-year expected graft survival at some centers is about 70%, and the 1-year expected graft survival at other centers is about 94%. And what that means is that these centers here in the 70%, they're taking on a lot more risk than the centers in the 94%. But remember, they get credit for this risk because all of that is risk adjusted away. And the same variation, we can see that for all of the other organ types as well. The last slide I'm going to show here goes kidney, liver, heart, lung, and all organs. This is the number of programs, and this is the proportion of programs that were flagged in the January 2009 PSR as an example for adult survival. And so you see that about 10% of programs are flagged every time. In a different webinar, we're going to talk about drilling down for your own program why your program is being flagged, if it's being flagged, for certain types of patients that you're taking on. But we'll leave that right now. So that's the slide set from the SRTR, and is worth going. If you go into this link here, there are a whole bunch more slides that explain some of that stuff in more detail. Definitely worth going through. The other thing I'm going to show you, if we go back to program-specific reports here, is the actual new report, because the new report has a lot of information. So the other thing that I'm going to go through is the new way that the SRTR is showing the actual models that you're being judged on. And this is really important. So if we go here to risk adjustment models, you can see by every organ system, you can see all of the models that are used. So here for kidney, for example, there are separate models for deceased donor and live donor. There's a model for 1-year graft survival, 1-year patient survival, 3-year graft survival, 3-year patient survival, etc. for each of these different things. And each of these models not only has different variables. For example, in living donor, we know that cold ischemia time won't make that big of a difference. And so it's going to be handled differently with living donor and deceased donor. So not only are there different variables, but the weight of the different variables are different depending on how they affect, for example, live donors or deceased donors. Let's go into the adult 1-year graft survival here. And you can see, basically, if you click on any of these things here, it'll open up a window and it'll show you the variable that's included and how much value, how much weight that variable carries in the overall model. Now, John Snyder, who's one of the epidemiologists and statisticians at the SRTR home base, he's going to go through all of these estimates and explain to you how to interpret them. And he's also going to show you these new things here where you can see the risk relationship between the change, for example, in cold ischemia time and the hazard that's expected to be associated with that. What I'm just going to show you here is where you can find the variables that are included. So for example, for deceased donor 1-year graft survival, there's cold time, DCD, donor age, donor cause of death, donor diabetes, donor hypertension, whether the kidney was pumped, donor race, donor creatinine, that's the terminal creatinine, the weight ratio, whether it was an ECD on top of all of those other donor things that we have, HLA mismatches, whether it was shipped outside of the DSA, the peak PRA, previous solid organ transplant in the recipient, age at transplant in the recipient, BMI, the diagnosis, this is the primary cause of ESRD, hepatitis C serology, insurance coverage, race, ethnicity, sex of the recipient, and then the time that the recipient was on renal replacement. And so those are all the variables that go into the model. The take-home message is there are a lot there, but there are things that are missing there too, and it's important for you to know what you get credit for in terms of risk-taking and what you don't get credit for. So now John's going to go through and tell you how to interpret these coefficients.
Great. Thanks, Dory. And my name is John Snyder. I'm with the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients in Minneapolis at the Minneapolis Medical Research Foundation. And what I want to do is just highlight a few key points and walk you through one of the documents that Dory showed you to give you some feeling of how to interpret the risk adjustment models that we use to assess transplant program performance. So what I have on my screen here is just our homepage, and I'm just going to focus on the risk adjustment models that we produce are housed in this area of the website here. So if you click here, what you get is all of our models are shown here, and it's important for the community to understand that we currently are maintaining over 60 risk adjustment models. And I'm going to say a little bit more about the process we're undertaking to update those models and make sure they're current. But what you can see on these tabs here, we have a tab for each of the major organ groups that we produce program-specific reports for. And the kidney tab is currently highlighted. And as Dory pointed out, you first see the deceased donor post-transplant survival models, followed down below by the living donor transplant models down in this area. And below that, we have the pre-transplant models that we currently maintain. So we've got models for transplant rates as well as waiting list mortality rate models. And so the tabs across the top here, of course, when you click on these tabs here, you get the other major organ groupings that we're currently maintaining risk adjustment models for. So as I said, we're currently maintaining over 60 of these, and I thought I would just take the opportunity to share with the community one exciting piece of work that we're undertaking. As shown on this slide here, the SRTR is undertaking a 3-year cycle to put some really focused attention into the risk adjustment models. Given that we currently have over 60 of these, it's very hard to dedicate focused energy to those models and improving them and making them better every 6 months. Of course, we put out the program-specific reports on 6-month cycles. And so what we proposed and what was suggested at the consensus conference that the SRTR and the OPTN jointly hosted in Washington, D.C. last February was this 3-year model building cycle. And what you can see is that during the first year, we've proposed that we would produce new kidney and pancreas transplant models. The Pancreas Committee spent some energy this past year devoted to developing new risk adjustment models that focus on the combined pancreas models, where we're modeling the pancreas after kidney models, the pancreas alone models, and the simultaneous kidney-pancreas models. So that effort's already been done. So we're focusing this year on the kidney risk adjustment models, and then in year 2 we would move on to the thoracic models, heart and lung, and the liver models. For each of these, we're proposing a 12-month process of model building, and during that process, which is highlighted on this next slide, during the first 4-month period, we're just working internally to develop some reports that we would share with the Kidney Transplant Committee of the OPTN to get their assistance and their feedback regarding which they feel are the most important variables to include in the risk adjustment models. And so that's actually been done. We're sort of in between months 4 and 5 on this current diagram. We currently have a subcommittee of the Kidney Transplantation Committee that's helping us look over the variables and offering their advice to us about what are the types of variables that they feel are most important to include in the risk adjustment models. And perhaps more importantly, what are the risk adjusters that they feel should not be included in the risk adjustment models because it would be inappropriate to adjust away certain types of risk. So those are important things. It's also giving the committee an opportunity to tell us what possibly are some additional risk adjusters that we should advocate for that currently aren't being collected by the OPTN. And so we're excited about this process, and that committee is doing their work right now, and we hope to be hearing back from them in the next few weeks. And then what we will do internally is go ahead and build the models, taking their recommendations under advisement, and then presenting the draft models back to the committee and getting their feedback, and then really producing final models. And while we would like this process to speed along quickly, this timeline, this 12-month window here, is actually working out to be fairly reasonable. At the end of this cycle, we hope to have some better models out there. And then what would happen is we would sort of live with these models for the intervening 2-year period, and then we would revisit them again, and there would be this revolving cycle that's predictable and would give us a chance to really put some concerted effort into each of these model groupings. Now, it's important to understand that as we move on then to the thoracic models, these processes can overlap. So we've actually already begun the month 1 and 2 process for the heart models. So we're working that process through now, and have embarked on rebuilding the heart post-transplant survival models as well. So just wanted to give you some thoughts about that process so that you can understand how we're approaching refining these models for the future. Let me go back to our website here. On our website, Dory was showing you this page where we have these new documents that we're very excited about. We really feel it's important for the community to understand which risk adjusters are in these models so that they can better understand how these works and what types of risk is being considered in these models so that they can better understand how they're caring for their patients and what that means for these models. So if we just show you one of these, I'll click on the kidney tab, the adult 1-year graft survival tab, and you come to this model here, and the first page you see is just a real broad tabular description of the model. So as Dory mentioned, the first column here, the characteristics, this shows you what elements are included in our risk adjustment models currently for kidney, deceased donor, adult, first-year graft survival. So you can see we've got cold ischemia time, donation after circulatory death, the donor age, various donor characteristics here as we scroll down, donor serum creatinine, we've got the number of HLA mismatches, et cetera, going on to some of the recipient characteristics, recipient body mass index, recipient age of transplant, diagnosis, et cetera. So if your first question is just what elements are included in our risk adjustment models, this is the place where you would go to find that information. Now what's shown here is the level of the characteristic. For example, here we have the recipient diagnosis, and here we see the level. So of course we've got these major groupings of primary cause of renal failure, and over here we have the estimate. And most of us in the community aren't real statistically savvy, so perhaps these numbers don't mean much to you, but that is where we were motivated to go on further and produce what you see further down the page is a more detailed description of each of these elements. And I just want to spend some time walking you through sort of a statistics epidemiology 101 of how to interpret these charts and how to interpret the risk relationships so that you can really get a better feel of how to interpret these models in your own practice. And so here again, on the first of all of these documents, we first show a table with the risk adjustment model, what characteristics are in the model, and what the estimates are. In this case, we're looking at the donor age variable. So what we're first showing is the distribution of donor age in the population, and this is just the most recent population that's included in the PSR models for deceased donor adult kidney graft survival. And then over here is the risk relationship. And in just a moment, I'll show you a little bit more how to interpret that particular figure. But first, it's important to understand that there are different types of risk adjusters that we put into these models. And before I show you how to interpret those figures, it's really helpful to understand some key basic concepts about the types of risk adjusters that we're including. And so I'm going to walk you through 3 things here. The first are what we call categorical risk adjusters. And these are things that contain distinct levels that are perhaps not necessarily ordered in any ordered fashion. So an example of this would be race, gender, primary cause of disease. Of gender, of course, we have 2 levels. They aren't in any particular order. Race, we've got any number of levels. Primary cause of disease, again, any number of levels that are distinct levels that aren't in any necessary order. There are things that could be ordered. For example, perhaps the number of HLA mismatches. You could argue that that's a continuous measure, but really you've got distinct levels from 0 to 6. And so that's sort of an ordered example with finite categories. So the first thing we're going to consider is when we put categorical risk adjusters into our models, how do we interpret those? The next kind of adjuster is what we call a continuous risk adjuster, and these are things that are measured on a continuous numerical scale. So good examples of this would be just age, recipient age, donor age, cold ischemia time as we measure it in hours, things that have a wide range of values and is generally on a numeric scale. These can be handled in a number of ways. I'll walk you through a few examples of how we handle those. And finally, these don't come into many of the models, but there are a few cases of these, and so it's important that you keep these in mind as you interpret some of these models. What we call interactions. This is when the effect of one risk adjuster is different depending on the level of a second risk adjuster. And I'll give you an example here. For liver recipients, we do have an interaction in a few of the models, and that is that the effect of the recipient being hepatitis C positive is different at different levels of donor age. And so in order to incorporate that risk profile, we include what's called an interaction. And you need to understand how that works so that when you see these figures on these tables that you have some idea of how to interpret what you're seeing. So those are the three basic types of things. There are certain nuances to each of those, of course, but if you just understand those three basics, it'll help you greatly as you interpret the models further down. So I'll walk you through a few examples of each of these. So first off, we've got these categorical risk adjusters, and I'm putting one here that's just simply a two-level risk adjuster, and that is, was the donor a DCD donor? Was this a donation after circulatory death? Of course, that has just a yes or no distinction. On this slide here, just highlighting this left figure, we see that we're first just describing for you what percentage of the population falls into this DCD category. And you can see in this case, 14.4% of the donors were listed as DCD donors, and 85.6% were not. So we just want you to understand nationally what's the frequency of this in the population that we're studying. The risk relationship is then described over here on the right, and I'll spend a little bit more time on this. On a categorical variable, we describe these things with what we call hazard ratios, and I'll tell you a little bit about how to interpret these. So we're going to get one for each level of the risk adjuster. And so you can see here for the yes, if this is a DC donor, this is a DCD donor, we have a risk adjuster of 1.56 hazard ratio. And that's compared to, we have to pick a reference group. Compared to what? Compared to a non-DCD donor. So the reference level is always going to give you a hazard ratio of 1. And so you can see here 1.56 on the scale of hazard ratios here. This is presented on a log scale. What that means is that if this is a DCD donor, we expect the failure rate in DCD donors, this is based on the national experience, to be 56% higher than the non-DCD donors, the reference level of 1. So that's how you interpret the 1.56. It's 56% higher risk than the reference level. So compared to non-DCD donors, these DCD donors had a 56% higher event rate. And so when you're considering what the effect of doing these DCD donors is on your models, we would expect your failure rate among these donors to be 56% higher because that was the national experience as modeled in our models. And does that mean you should avoid doing DCD donors? No, absolutely not. This means that we're actually taking into account in our models what the expected value would be for these donors so that that's accounted for when we tally up your observed and expected ratio. So it's important for you to understand if these things are in our models, avoiding a DCD donor is not necessarily going to help your outcomes because we are taking into account that we would naturally expect perhaps slightly worse outcomes among those donors based on the national experience. So if I move along, I'm going to show you a few slides on continuous risk factors. And I'm starting with the example of cold ischemia time. Now, given that this is a continuous variable, we first show you the sort of range that we had in our data and a histogram of what the distribution was of cold ischemia time in the population. Over here to the right, we present some basic summary statistics about what the cold time was for adult deceased donor kidney graft survival in this case. So you can see we had a mean of 17.7 hours, minimum reported of just over 0. 25th percentile was 11 hours. The 75th percentile was 22 hours, missing in 3.45% of the population. And this just describes that visually. So you can see most donors were sort of down in this high teen range for cold ischemia time with a mean of 17.7. Now, when we model continuous risk adjusters and we present the risk relationship over here, it sort of functions similarly to what I showed you with the categorical risk predictors, except now we have to come up with a risk at each level of a continuous predictor. And so you can imagine on the previous slide, we just had two of these things. We've had a yes and a no level for DCD donors. Imagine now that we need 100 of these things lined up. And in this case, we're modeling it as a linear effect. So that what that happens to give us is just one straight line showing the risk relationship across the range of cold ischemia time. In order to make sense of that line, we have to pick a reference level. In this case, on our figures, we've picked a reference level of 17, which is shown here at the 17.7, which was just the mean. And so that's indicated on the graph here with this vertical line. That's showing where that 17.7 mean is for cold ischemia time. So everywhere else on this line is compared to that 17.7 mean level of cold time. And so you can see as cold time increases, the hazard increases. So we would expect a higher failure rate across the range of cold time as cold time is increasing. So if I just, as an example, pick, say I had a cold time of 30. Well, you can eyeball across here that 30 cold time is here. If we eyeball that across, that's about a 1.1 hazard ratio. And so the way you would interpret that is a person with a cold time of 30 has about a 10% increased risk of graft failure compared to somebody with a cold time of 17.7 hours, the mean. That picking that mean was arbitrary. We just have to pick some level so that you can have some reference to compare across the range. On the other side of the coin, if you pick somebody with less cold time, say down here around 5 hours of cold time, you can see that that is perhaps, if you eyeball across 0.9, say 10% less risk than someone with a cold time of 17.7 hours. You can pick any point on that line. If you pick 40, it looks like that's about a 1.2 risk. So you could say about 20% higher risk of graft failure is expected in a donor with a 40-hour cold time compared to a donor with a 17.7-hour cold time. So that's the first way that we would handle these. And it's important in this case to just make note that what we've got here is really a straight line relationship because we've modeled it that way. There didn't appear to be evidence that this wasn't a linear relationship that was perhaps curved or some other function. And so we modeled it as a straight line, feeling that that captured the relationship fairly well. That necessarily isn't true across all of our models. And I'm going to show you, in this case, we're looking at recipient body mass index. So this is just another figure from the same model. And again, we show the distribution here on the left, so you can just eyeball that right off the bat and see that the mean was just above 25, sort of the bulk of this curve here. And you can see actually the mean was 28.1 with a maximum of about 45 and a minimum of about 10. And this is a risk relationship that we see across many areas of medicine when we look at body mass index. Increasing risk as you go below sort of the normal range of BMI, and then increasing risk as you go high on the BMI index. So it's almost this V-shaped relationship here. And the way that we're currently modeling this in our models is with basically if you think of a linear relationship but splitting it up into chunks. So we split this up at certain points where you can see these break points, and we fit a line to the data that looks like this. And so it's allowing it the break point to happen. So BMI of about 25 in this case is giving the lowest risk, and then you can see as you go up from 25 your risk is increasing, and as you go down from 25 your risk is increasing. And so that's how you would interpret this. Again, in this case we chose a reference of the mean, so at this case it's 28.1, and so the way you would interpret these lines is just in reference to somebody who had a BMI of 28.1. So in this case, if we look at somebody with a BMI say of 35, eyeballing across about a 20% increased risk compared to somebody who's at this crosshair here at the 28.1 BMI. So that you can eyeball across that and see how the risk compares to somebody who was actually at the average BMI. So that's sort of a second way that we model these things. If you're looking through the risk models, you might see some that are modeled as a curve. The interpretation is exactly the same. There will be a mean line shown, and so everyone on that curve is being compared to somebody who is the average of whatever that risk factor was. And so the fact that this is a broken straight line is no different than if this was a curve. So understanding interactions is a little bit more difficult, and I'm going to give you one example, and this is from the liver deceased donor adult first-year graft survival model. And previous work had shown that there was an interaction between the recipient being diagnosed with hepatitis C and the donor age. And so the first way is, well, how do you identify that there's an interaction present? Because you need to keep this in mind as you interpret these estimates in the table and the subsequent graphs. And we've tried to label these things in the characteristic. We put the word interaction right up front, so you know that there was an interaction between two of the risk predictors, in this case, recipient hepatitis C status and the donor age. This next level shows sort of exactly how it was interacted. But what this tells you is that when you look down in the figures below in these documents, you need to be wary that you're not going to find a separate example for hepatitis C or for donor age. And because there's an interaction, you can't interpret one without interpreting the other. And so what we do in our models is we will have a set of figures for each of those things, a diagnosis of HCV in this case, where we show how many were HCV positive in the population, in this case about 43%. But then when you get over to the risk relationship, there's one thing you'll notice right away, is that we have a categorical thing that we're modeling the diagnosis of HCV, so we only have two distinct levels. But on the right, we show a continuous line, and that is because donor age is a continuous element, and we have to take the donor age into account when we're interpreting whether or not the patient was HCV positive. And so what happens here is you have to interpret the effect of hepatitis C status in the recipient at each level of donor age. So at this case, if the donor was, say, 40, this line appears to be at about perhaps 1.3. So that would say that if the donor was 40, the effect of being hepatitis C positive compared to a donor who's also 40, who's hepatitis C negative, is about a 30% increased risk. And you can see that as the donor goes up in age, that effect becomes more dramatic. So you can see at 60, if the donor was 60, the effect was perhaps 40% higher risk if the recipient was hepatitis C with a donor age of 60 compared to a recipient who is hepatitis C negative, also with the donor age of 60. So it's important to remember that you have to sort of hold the donor age constant when interpreting these things. And the line is telling you the effect of being hepatitis C positive versus being hepatitis C negative at that level of donor age. Now, since we can't interpret the effect of hepatitis C independently of donor age because of this interaction, later on down the page, when you look at the risk relationship for donor age, which is shown here on this next slide, you see sort of the reverse of this. In this case, we've got donor age broken into categories here, and so you can see what the proportion of recipients, what the age of their donors were in this population. You see that there are two lines on this graph now instead of just one. The solid line in this case is if there was no diagnosis of hepatitis C in the recipient, and the dashed line is if there was a diagnosis of hepatitis C. Again, because there's this interaction, we cannot interpret one without knowing the other. So in this, it's sort of the reverse of the previous slide I showed you. So each of these things is now compared to a donor age of 55 and a recipient who is hepatitis C negative. And so any point on this line that you want to follow across and see what the risk was, it's compared to a recipient who is hepatitis C negative and a donor age of 55. So that's some brief introduction to Epidemiology 101 and the interpretation of interactions. And so across all our models, there currently aren't many of these, but when you do encounter them, it's helpful to understand what they mean. So again, those are all shown, go back to our website. Those are all shown here. We do have separate model documentation for each of these things for adult and pediatric survival. These are all first-year survival, graft survival here, again, living donor down below. And we hope that these things are more descriptive for you and helping you understand these models as you peruse the SRTR website and wonder exactly what elements are included in your risk adjustment, what elements are not. And of course, on our website, under the Contact the SRTR, we do give a telephone line and there's email contact information here. We certainly welcome your feedback. If you have any feedback for us about these models or the way we're presenting them here, we'd be happy to hear from you. And we hope to really keep you informed about the progress moving forward, rebuilding the kidney models currently, moving on to the heart models next, followed by the lung and then the liver. We're excited about this process. We really feel it will result in better risk adjustment models moving forward that the community will have, hopefully feel they've had a lot of input in. We're trying to listen as best we can to what the community wants in these models and what we need to collect to adequately risk adjust the risk in these populations. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Dr. Segev, and please again, just contact us at the SRTR if you have any comments. Thanks.
Okay, so now you have a sense of all of the things that go into these models, and then the last thing I'm just going to show you, which most of you have seen before, is these program reports, and you can get these from the SRTR website. You just click on the organ here, so let's look at liver, and then you get every one of the centers. You can go state by state if you want here, and then you can see a center, the number of candidates on the list, and whether the 1-year survival is as expected, higher than expected, or lower than expected, etc. So this is where your data go, and then anybody from the public can pull up this new format of the report and go through all of the details for your center. So that's how it's done, and hopefully this was useful, and we'll have other webinars drilling in on some of the other features of the program-specific reports and of the regulatory environment. So thank you.